Hello and welcome to my Beatles YouTube channel. If you like the Beatles, please make sure you subscribe and you check out my other videos because you're definitely gonna find them interesting. Today I'm gonna show you the top 10 Beatles locations in London. We're gonna start with some places that you might not know and we're gonna end with the most famous ones. So let's go! Number 10. Paul McCartney's offices at 1 Soho Square. Here you'll find the headquarters of MPL Communications. MPL stands for McCartney Productions Limited, and it was founded in February 1969 by Paul McCartney following the advice of his father-in-law Lee Eastman to invest in music publishing. MPL owns entire catalogs of many different artists, including of course Paul McCartney himself. It's here where you might catch a glimpse of Paul McCartney if you're very lucky. Number 9. Marylebone Station. Very close to Baker Street in the Marylebone area, you'll find Marylebone Station, a beautiful railway station where the Beatles filmed the opening scene of A Hard Day's Night. Here you can see the Beatles running away from a crowd of fans, and we see George Harrison trip and hit the ground. This wasn't in the script and George Harrison actually tripped, and that's why it's so funny. But not everything would be bad for George that day, because one of the extras was Pattie Boyd. They met here, they started dating, and eventually they got married on the 21st of January 1966. Number 8. For this one, I'm gonna show you a couple of recording studios that were of importance in the story of the Beatles. In West Hampstead, you'll find the former site of Decca Records. On New Year's Day 1962, the Beatles traveled all the way from Liverpool to audition for Decca Records, hoping to secure a record deal that would launch their careers into the stratosphere. The audition was held right here in this building. The Beatles, who were still playing with Pete Best, recorded 15 songs picked by Brian Epstein. The tapes were later found and included in the Beatles anthology. A few weeks after the audition, Decca Records shockingly rejected the Beatles, saying that they had no future in music business and that guitar groups were on their way out. Nice. Trident Studios. In the middle of Soho, you'll find the former site of Trident Studios. It was established in 1968 and it was equipped with the most advanced technology at the time. The Beatles were still recording on 8 tracks at Abbey Road, but Trident Studios was equipped with a 16-track machine. It was because of these technological advantages that the Beatles decided to try Trident Studios, and they first recorded their single Hey Jude. After that, they also recorded a couple of songs for their White album at Trident, including Honey Pie and Martha My Dear. At this time, the Beatles also had their own record label called Apple Records, and they used Trident Studios for many of their Apple Records artists, including Badfinger and Billy Preston. Trident Studios was home to many recordings by Queen, Elton John and David Bowie. We can actually see a blue plaque dedicated to David Bowie outside the studio. Trident was equipped with a beautiful grand piano that became really famous. It had a very particular sound and you can hear it in songs like Hey Jude or Elton John Your Song. Okay, so let's move on to the next studio. We are here in Denmark Street. Denmark Street is full of music shops, and back in the day it was a very important hub for the music industry. Here there's a music shop called Regent Sound, and it's in the former site of Regent Sound Studios. Not many people know of this place, but Regent Sound was established in the 1940s, and it was frequented by many different artists, including the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix Experience, Black Sabbath, among many others. The Beatles recorded their song Fixing a Hole at Regent Sound. That day, Paul attended the session with a lunatic that claimed to be Jesus Christ. Apparently he rang the bell at Paul's house and Paul said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Jesus." And Paul said, "Well, you better come in then." They had a cup of tea and then he said, "Oh, I have to go to a session, but if you want, and if you promise to be very quiet, you can come with me." So that's the day the Beatles met Jesus Christ at Regent Sound Studio. And finally, in the beautiful neighborhood of Hampstead in North London, we have Air Studios. Air was established by the fifth Beatle. I'm talking about producer George Martin. The first studio was in Oxford Circus, in the middle of central London. But in 1991 they moved here. This is an old church that has been converted to a studio. Air has been home to many famous recordings, especially music for films. Producer George Martin also started Air Montserrat in the Caribbean island of Montserrat, but Hurricane Hugo destroyed the studios and they eventually had to close that branch. So that's it for recording studios for now, let's move on. Number 7. The Beatles' first London home at 57 Green Street. In the Mayfair area, very close to Bond Street Station, you'll find 57 Green Street, the Beatles' first London home and the only place where the 4 Beatles ever lived together. As the Beatles were gaining popularity, they started traveling from Liverpool to London very often. In 1963, however, it became very clear that they should move to London for good. So manager Brian Epstein found this flat for them as a temporary solution. The Beatles lived in flat L. I actually once had the chance to see the inside of the building. It was right there outside their flat where they took the picture that was used for the cover of the Beatles book 1963. John Lennon was already a family man, so Cynthia Powell and Julian Lennon were also living with the Beatles. However, this didn't last very long. John and his family moved to Kensington, George and Ringo stayed in the flat for a bit longer, and Paul moved to 57 Wimpole Street, which is actually our next stop. Number 6. 57 Wimpole Street. In 1963, Paul was dating the actress Jane Asher, and she lived with her parents right here at 57 Wimpole Street. Her dad was a doctor and her mum was a music teacher who once taught George Martin to play the oboe. Paul got on really well with the Ashers, and in 1963 they invited him to make their family home his London base. Paul was already rich and famous, but still decided to live here with his in-laws until 1966. He was given a room at the top of the house at the back. He had a small piano and a record player. Underneath the bed he kept his gold records and his MBE. It was actually right here where Paul McCartney woke up one morning with a tune in his head. He went straight to the piano and he started singing. The melody was what we now know as Yesterday. However, at the time he thought he was merely remembering someone else's melody. So the original lyrics were something like scrambled eggs, oh my darling how I love your legs, but not as much as I like scrambled eggs. He didn't bother writing proper lyrics to it because it's not my song, he thought. For a couple of months he was obsessed with this tune and he asked everyone he knew if they recognized the melody. But no one did, so Paul thought, well, it's probably mine then. And then he changed the lyrics for what we now know as Yesterday, which was voted by the Rolling Stone magazine as the best song of the 20th century, and it's also the most covered song of all times. Jane had a brother called Peter Asher, and he became really good friends with Paul. He was also a musician and he had a band called Peter and Gordon. Paul wrote a song called A World Without Love, but John Lennon didn't like it, so Paul gave it to Peter Asher and he recorded it with Peter and Gordon, and the song became a #1 hit. Peter Asher also ended up working for Apple Records as an A&R, and he eventually discovered and recorded the first record of American singer-songwriter James Taylor. Mrs. Asher had a music room in the basement, and it was right there where John and Paul wrote I Wanna Hold Your Hand, the Beatles' first #1 in America. Hi, sorry to interrupt the video. Just a very quick, very important announcement. I published a book. That's right, I published a book. It's called From the Cavern to Abbey Road, a journey through the Beatles' iconic landmarks. In this book, we see the story of the Beatles from the places where everything happened. Some of them are famous, like let's say Abbey Road Studios, and some of them perhaps not so famous, like for example the art gallery where John and Yoko met. I put a lot of work and effort into this book, and it would help me so much if you grabbed a copy. It's available on Amazon all around the world, so if you want your copy, please go to the link in the description. Thank you, now back to the video. Number 5. The former Apple Boutique in Baker Street. The Apple Boutique opened its doors in December 1967 as a part of the larger Apple Core project, an ambitious endeavor by the Beatles to break away from the traditional music business model. Situated at 94 Baker Street, the Apple Boutique offered more than just merchandise. It sought to encapsulate the countercultural spirit of the times. The boutique's inventory was a reflection of the band's eclectic taste, featuring an array of clothing, accessories, and psychedelic paraphernalia. The launch party was attended by celebrities like Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, and it was hosted by John Lennon and George Harrison. Outside the building we can find a blue plaque dedicated to both of them. One of the standout features of the Apple Boutique was the colorful and psychedelic artwork that adorned the building. However, the Westminster neighbors were not so happy with it, prompting complaints that eventually led to the removal of the mural. The Apple Boutique struggled to turn a profit and closed its doors in July 1968. The Beatles' wives were allowed to take everything they wanted from the store, and the rest of the stock was given away to the public. Number 4. 34 Montagu Square. Located in Marylebone, in a beautiful area of London and right next to the Swedish Embassy, we have 34 Montagu Square. Beatles drummer Ringo Starr leased this flat in the early 60s and moved here with his wife Maureen. But following the birth of their first son, they moved to a much bigger house in Weybridge, Surrey. The flat was empty for a while and Ringo allowed Paul to set up a small recording studio in the basement. The studio was short-lived, but it was here where Paul wrote Eleanor Rigby and where he recorded the first demo of I'm Looking Through You. After that, Ringo rented the flat to Chas Chandler, the former bassist of The Animals. He moved into the ground floor with his girlfriend, while the basement was occupied by an artist that Chas Chandler recently started to manage, an American guitarist called Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix moved into the basement with his girlfriend Kathy. However, they didn't stay in the flat for too long because they used to throw parties all the time and they received so many noise complaints that they eventually got kicked out. After that, the flat was rented to Lillian Powell, Cynthia Powell's mother and John Lennon's mother-in-law. In May 1968, Cynthia Powell went on a holiday to Greece. When she returned, she found John and Yoko together. She stormed out of the house and moved to 34 Montagu Square with her mother. They eventually swapped houses, Cynthia and her mum Lillian moving back to Kenwood in Weybridge, and John and Yoko moved to 34 Montagu Square. It was right here where they took the controversial pictures used for the cover of the album Two Virgins. It was also right here where police officer Norman Pilcher searched the house for drugs. And he did find drugs, although many people suggest that the drugs have been planted. John and Yoko were arrested. Yoko was a Japanese citizen, so John didn't want Yoko to get deported, and that's why he pleaded guilty. He had to pay a fine of £500, which even at that time it was not too much money for an artist like John Lennon. However, it was this drug conviction what the American government used as an excuse not to allow him to stay in America for many years until he finally managed to get a green card. Number 3. Paul McCartney's house at 7 Cavendish Avenue. Paul McCartney bought this house in St. John's Wood in 1965 for the price of £40,000. He finally moved here in March 1966 after he had made renovations and installed a sizable gate and intercom system to ensure his privacy. However, the location was quickly discovered by Beatles fans who were often found outside the house hoping to catch a glimpse of Paul. While John Lennon, George Harrison and Ringo Starr moved to Weybridge, Paul McCartney decided to stay in the city. His proximity to clubs and museums aligned with his artistic spirit and his desire to stay connected to the ever-evolving London scene. Paul lived here for many years and as of 2024 he still keeps the house. It's not his main residence anymore, but every time he's in London he stays here. Due to its proximity to Abbey Road studios, the Beatles would often hang out here, and they would also write songs in the music room on the top floor. Paul also had a meditation chapel in the backyard. After a heated argument, John Lennon once threw a brick through Paul McCartney's window. The house also inspired the song She Came In Through the Bathroom Window from the Abbey Road album, after a fan managed to climb into Paul McCartney's house, entering through the bathroom window. Number 2. Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row. 3 Savile Row, known as the Apple Building, was the headquarters of Apple Corps, a company the Beatles started for tax purposes. After the death of manager Brian Epstein, the Beatles were advised to start a business to save a significant amount of money from the taxman. Therefore, they started Apple Corps. The idea was to break away from the traditional music business model. In a press conference in America, John Lennon and Paul McCartney made it clear that they weren't in it for the money. They already done that, and now they wanted to help other artists. Conceived in the midst of the Beatles' psychedelic years, Apple Corps emerged as a multimedia conglomerate encapsulating Apple Records, Apple Electronics, Apple Films, and Apple Retail, whose most notable venture was the Apple Boutique in Baker Street, and others. The Apple building was also home to the Apple Studio, located in the basement, where they recorded most of the Get Back sessions. It was in the rooftop of 3 Savile Row where the Beatles played the famous rooftop concert in January 1969, marking the last time the Beatles ever played live together. Despite their visionary ideas, the Beatles faced challenges managing Apple Corps, ultimately leading to financial mismanagement and internal discord. Their idealistic approach, while noble, proved impractical, leading to costly projects and ventures that strained the company's resources. Number 1. Abbey Road Studios. Before achieving global fame as the recording studio of the Beatles, Abbey Road had a rich history dating back to its establishment in 1931 as the world's first purpose-built recording studio by the Gramophone Company, the predecessor of EMI. EMI Studios hosted renowned artists like Sir Edward Elgar, contributing to its reputation as a premier venue for classical music recordings. The studios became an integral part of the war effort during World War II, producing morale-boosting broadcasts. The Beatles recorded most of their music at EMI Studios, from their first single Love Me Do to their last album, which they named Abbey Road. For the cover of the album, they took a picture crossing the street outside the studio, a photo destined to be recreated by artists and Beatles fans from all around the world. It was after the release of the album Abbey Road that EMI Studios changed its name to Abbey Road Studios. The studios saw the Beatles evolve as musicians, from their early days to years of experimentation and psychedelic recordings like Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and Magical Mystery Tour, to the final days of the Beatles' career with Abbey Road, and many of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr's solo albums. Together with producer George Martin and sound engineers Jeff Emerick and Norman Smith, the Beatles changed music history forever at Abbey Road Studios. As of 2024, Abbey Road Studios is still very relevant in the music industry, particularly in the recording of music for films. Iconic film scores like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Indiana Jones were recorded here at Studio 1. Studio 2 is where the Beatles spent most of their time, although they actually recorded in all of them, and Studio 3 is actually my favorite, was the home of most of the Revolver album and also home to the recording of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. So this is pretty much it for now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. You can also follow me on Instagram or Facebook. There is a PayPal link for donations. Of course, every donation will be absolutely appreciated. You can also buy my book. Actually, that would make me very happy indeed. The Amazon link is in the description. Or the free option is just to subscribe to this YouTube channel and maybe click the bell icon so you're the first to know when I upload new videos. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.
Well, I'm afraid that's us run out of time.
Oh,
I'm really
okay.
sorry.
Oh,
So,
bye, everyone.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I give my heart to you, I must be sure from the very